that you're muted when you log on, but make sure that you mute yourself as well. We have plenty of time after the panel session for questions and answers, and we want to make sure that we get as many of those involved as possible. Throughout the webinar, make sure to use the function on your GoToMeeting tool to submit those questions. You can either do it by submitting a question, using the chat, or raising your hand. If you raise your hand, we'll call on you and unmute you so that you can ask your question directly. You can also use the chat functions to report any technical issues or problems that you're encountering during the webinar, and we will do our best to help you solve the problem so that you can have a better webinar experience. You can also use the chat function to communicate between attendees as a way to emphasize a point heard during the presentation, and we really encourage people to try and make this as engaging an experience as possible. It's a little hard. We have the great fortune of having a lot of people on this webinar today. The downside is that we can't just open up all of the lines for free discussion, though. Finally, I want to let you know that we're going to be recording today's webinar and posting that onto the National Adaptation Forum.org website. So feel free to share it with others afterwards. Or if you have to leave early, come back and hear the end. Next slide, please. We have an interesting coincidence that I wanted to point out for everyone attending this webinar, because clearly this is a topic of interest to you. The White House currently has open a call for nominations for White House Champions of Change for Climate Equity. The web link is on the slide that you're seeing right now to get more details on what you need to do to nominate someone, and nominations are due by Friday, June 10th. At 11:59 p.m. Eastern, in case you want to stay up and do it until the very last minute. Next slide, please, because with this one, I get to introduce the moderator for today's discussion. It is my great pleasure to introduce all of you to Nile Malloy. He is a climate equity strategist and consultant who's been working on economic development, public health, community organizing, philanthropic relationship building, climate change, and environmental justice for over 15 years. He's participated as a program committee member for both the California and the National Adaptation Forum, and this year he's serving on the steering committee for both of those forums. He's also a senior manager at the Neighborhood Funders Group, leading their Democratizing Development program. And with that, I turn today's fantastic program over to Nile.
Thank you so much, Laura. Can everyone hear me? Mm-hmm. Great. So this is a great conversation that I really think I'm so honored to be a part of, moderating this distinguished panel. But before we get started, I'm going to kind of give a little bit of context, to the discussion. So as we advance our thinking, strategies, and approaches in the climate adaptation field, and a holistic adaptation approach should include the climate equity, and how community-based institutions, local government, philanthropy, and other agencies can more meaningfully engage vulnerable and impacted communities in being more climate resilient and climate prepared. Building community resilience requires significant structural shifts to address the root causes of climate change, as well as comprehensive place-based innovations, such as increased social cohesion, localization of food and energy systems, and advances in democratic participation practices that can work together to ensure equity and sustainability in food, water, energy, transportation, land use, housing, jobs, and economic opportunity. My hope for this call is to continue to build a learning community of climate justice and adaptation field leaders to tackle climate change together, and to further encourage the public sector to continue to address meaningful engagement of the most at-risk community with protecting our cities from unpredictability of climate disruption. And we all deserve the ability to participate, engage, implement, and access resources to bounce back together from climate impacts. And with that said, I want to just kind of briefly, introduce our presenters. And the way that this is going to be organized today is I have a series of questions, and each presenter will give a few minutes to basically talk specifically about their work. and I will be doing follow-up questions and introducing them back to answer those questions. So for the presenters, I'm actually keeping time as well, so I'm going to let you know when there's 30 seconds left, so you can wrap up your comment. But overall, I'm just really excited about the individuals we have presenting to us. So the first person, the first person we will have present is Ryan Chavez. He is the infrastructure coordinator at UPROSE based in New York. And he serves, which UPROSE is a community-based environmental social justice organization in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. He manages several local planning, research, and public policy initiatives across such fields as transportation, energy, economic development, and community health. And Ryan also holds an MS in city and regional planning from Pratt Institute. So the question that Ryan will be answering, and the other presenters as well, will be share with us what kind of work your institution is doing around climate change, climate preparedness, and climate adaptation, and what does equity in climate adaptation, planning, preparedness, and implementation mean to your institution and your work? So Ryan, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Nile, and thank you all for the opportunity to speak this afternoon in New York, and this morning to those of you in other time zones. Really excited to be able to present a vision of climate adaptation from the perspective of a frontline community. I'd also like to just take a minute to extend our thanks to the Kresge Foundation for their generous support of the work that we do at UPROSE. We have been able to leverage this support to really build, a number of other innovative climate justice projects locally driven by community through our community climate justice and community resiliency center. I just want to lay out this vision by making it clear that the work that we do locally in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, really operates under this model of just transitions, which recognizes that the intersection of these ecological and economic and racial crises that we're facing are really interconnected. And when we speak about a just transition away from the fossil fuel economy, away from extractive relationships and economics, this really insists that we put frontline communities on the forefront of these challenges. When we're speaking about not only sustainable energy, but also sustainable local economies. And the work that we do around climate adaptation really started out on a block-by-block organizing level. Sunset Park is a frontline community, and that it's one of the largest industrial waterfronts in New York City, which has some of the heaviest clusters of noxious and industrial uses in New York. And it's a low-income, working-class community of color along the waterfront, which makes it highly vulnerable to the impacts of extreme weather and storm surge. Starting out on a block-by-block organizing level, really trying to identify those local leaders in the community that could serve as block captains or point people in the event of extreme weather. Really led us to really be trying to identify climate adaptation opportunities in Sunset Park, driven by the community, and things that could be done on a very localized, small-scale, fine-grained DIY level. So on one hand, this is a really sort of localized effort of climate adaptation, but we're also looking at, larger scale infrastructure projects that could be implemented in Sunset Park, leveraging the industrial nature of the community. Next slide. So as I mentioned, Sunset Park has the largest industrial waterfront in New York City, which has always sort of served as a double-edged sword in terms of the environmental burdens that it places on the community on one hand, but also on the other, the economic opportunities that it's always afforded the local working class community. One of the sort of climate crises that we're currently facing locally is that we're at a severe risk of losing this manufacturing land. Waterfront properties in New York City are becoming more increasingly valuable and increasingly desirable for developments that are non-industrial. And we have several interests that are really pushing to commercialize industrial properties along our waterfront, flip them to other land uses that will yield higher profits, but will really undermine the local manufacturing base that has supported the local community for generations. Now, on one hand, you might say that this is a form of adaptation, that it's sort of rezoning away some of the environmental burdens, some of the climate hazards that the local community faces along the industrial waterfront. But for us, this is not a climate justice solution, and it actually undermines a very valuable opportunity. Next slide. So for us, when we look at the industrial waterfront, we really see it as a place where we can be building for the future of New York City and the region overall. We know that there's going to be upwards of tens of billions of dollars going into climate adaptation and resiliency measures moving forward in New York City and the region. And from our perspective, a just transition solution would be to leverage local manufacturing and industrial areas in working class communities in need of meaningful and dignified work in order to produce the materials, the components that are going to go into rebuilding and fortifying New York City. So what we really work hard to do is to really work with some of the small local industrial businesses to help them adapt, their operations. We have a grant right now from the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences to work specifically with small auto shops in Sunset Park, which are really sort of integral to the local economy. And are also, pose a public health threat in the event of storm surge. And we're working with them specifically to adapt how they operate to reduce the risk of chemical release. And as well with other small industrial businesses, we're working with them in order to introduce more resiliency and adaptation methodologies into their operations. Another opportunity that the industrial waterfront provides, is the real chance to develop renewable energy. So we are working currently to develop community-owned, locally owned solar energy through virtual net metering, which low-income or working-class families in Sunset Park could actually own a share of. And in turn would really reduce the energy burden that so many of them are feeling right now. And so what this does is it really sort of gets at this just transition model in terms of really leveraging the industrial sector for sustainable and just economic development, while at the same time putting these working class communities of color on the front lines of adaptation, resilience, and innovation.
Thank you so much, Ryan. And just to let you know, Elizabeth Yampier from UPROSE, the executive director, was unable to make it, so Ryan did a great job in filling those shoes, so thank you so much. Our next presenter is going to be Shalini Gupta from CEED. And Shalini has been a leader in forging solutions to our environmental crisis that are grounded in economic and social history. And as the executive director of the Center for Earth, Energy, and Democracy, he has worked in a range of various organizations, local grassroots groups, to international organizations engaging in the promotion of sound environmental policy and environmental justice. She was also a governor appointee to the Minnesota's Next Generation Energy Board, with prior positions at the Department of Energy's Argonne National Laboratory and as the Senior Energy Associate at the IWLA Midwest office. Shalini?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Shalini Gupta. So the Center for Earth, Energy, and Democracy, we are based in Minneapolis, in Minnesota. And we work nationally, and we're really founded as an organization that is grounded in sort of how do we start to integrate equity into environmental, energy, and climate policy Our staff has decades of work on research and policy analysis in this area, and really focus our work on developing tools and information for policymakers and grassroots communities around climate and energy policy, community planning, and training and education. So thank you so much for asking us to present today. I know Minnesota is also going to be hosting NAF next year, so I think it's a very exciting time for us to be part of the program committee around this. Next slide, please. So one of the things I wanted to share in terms of, we were asked to look at some of our community resiliency, climate resiliency work that we're doing here. And a lot of our community-based research that we conduct has really started to look at, from a community-based lens, what's a framework that we can develop for sort of intersectional understanding of what climate resiliency means for vulnerable communities. So as we're discovering through our work with many groups on the ground here in the Midwest, as well as nationally, there are many components to community resiliency in the face of climate change. And so this is our effort to start to sort of outline some of the sectoral issues that we're seeing highlighted in terms of the multiplicity of issues that make up community resiliency within the climate resiliency field. And those deal with air quality, economics and employment, energy, environment, food, housing, transportation, and community. Just to pull out a few examples of kind of where this where our understanding is going from a community-based lens around this is for air quality. We're finding the objectives and goals are really around a healthy air quality and looking at what the impact climate change may be having on local air quality. And then how are the policies and programs associated with that? So it's on the right-hand column, it starts to look at, so if air quality is going to be impacted by a change in climate in terms of sort of impact to VOCs or particulate matter or sort of exacerbation of hotspot areas, what are existing policy and programs, such as state implementation plans for existing criteria air pollutants that states have to develop? What are some city business incentives, permits, as just some of the policies and programs that, one, have sort of underlyingly created the vulnerability that we are sort of looking at in the first place, so the underlying vulnerability in these communities. And we go through and we sort of highlighted some of the policies and programs related to each of these sectors that are coming out through our work. Another one I wanted to highlight was around the transportation sector. So with objectives and goals that are being articulated around efficient transportation, sustainable, equitable transportation, that link into policies and programs that really look at emissions reductions from different either semi-truck transit routes or different types of vehicle efficiency standards, transit access, and safety issues. And this one is an interesting one to highlight because here in Minneapolis, what we found was when the city was doing its Minneapolis Climate Action Plan, the transportation arena, before the Environmental Justice Working Group got involved, had no mass transit options within it. And so the sort of community lens in terms of what are the policies and programs that start to really sort of at a local level, sort of across the board, that a lot of these policies are across the urban areas in the country. What are these policies that have contributed to the underlying vulnerabilities? And so in order to sort of improve community resiliency, we really need to be focusing on. And I think that the challenge is that a lot of offices and agencies have been struggling to look at what some of these intersections and local implementation of these policies are that I mentioned on the right-hand side. So in my next slide, I'm going to we're working to get deeper into all of these areas that I just mentioned across the CR sectors in my prior slide. But with the limit of time, I just want to use one example of energy that we're working on as well. So in terms of the climate resiliency elements of energy, we know that energy is a fundamental piece of life today. The energy system supplies us with the basic needs of water, cooking, heating, and obviously the energy system is impacted by climate change, either due to fuel stability, price, increased demand, and will have an impact on community resiliency. And one element of that is that it'll have a different, there will be a difference in people's ability to afford energy. And so what we're looking at here is some mapping we've done in development of an energy poverty or energy vulnerability index. And so the yellow sort of outlined boxes there are areas of Minneapolis-St. Paul that have been articulated as having a high energy vulnerability. And the underlying sort of darker shaded areas, the underlying layer there is minority populations. And so while we can see that there is a higher energy vulnerability in minority populations in the Twin Cities, it's not necessarily across the board. And so it speaks to, one, the level of granularity needed if you're thinking about sort of energy efficiency programs, how to target them. Just using sort of one indicator of low income may not be adequate enough if you're trying to really target issues of energy vulnerability in a community. The other piece I want to point out here is that in terms of energy efficiency, when a lot of the infrastructure money came down to the air dollars a few years back, what you'll see is that a very large percentage, overwhelming percentage of the resources for that actually went into sort of the areas, the sort of lighter areas of the map, which had a much lower minority population, as well as not as much energy vulnerability. And so what we saw happening, and has seen happen, is that without sort of an intentional sort of focusing of the energy efficiency dollars, they went to the higher income, whiter areas of the Twin Cities area. And so if we think of energy efficiency as a climate resiliency booster, so in terms of better insulated homes, lower energy costs, in this case, climate resiliency funding, or the energy efficiency funding, when just looked at sort of a macro level, if you just look at a city level, without looking at the variability within the city of where the vulnerability actually exists, that climate resiliency energy efficiency funding actually increased the relative vulnerability gap. So this is the type of analysis that we're trying to refine and work on, and why we feel that a place-based understanding of climate resiliency is so critical if we're really thinking about how to, at a more granular level, really have impact in terms of building climate resiliency. I'll stop there. Thanks, Nash.
Great. Thank you so much, Shalini. Great. So our next presenter will be Garrett Fitzgerald. He's the Urban Sustainability Directors Network Strategic Partnership Advisor. He will be leaving the conversation right after the discussion. So Tristan Baja with the City of Baltimore, who's a part of the network, will also stick around to answer any questions if you have anything about Urban Sustainability Directors Network specifically. But Garrett Fitzgerald supports USDN and strategic planning, organizing collaborative activities, and engaging external partners to help USDN members advance their work. He is based in Washington, D.C. Garrett previously managed the Sustainability Oakland program from 2008 to 2013 for the City of Oakland and served as Programs Director for ICLA USA. He is also on the board of Star Communities and co-chair development of ECLE's community scale greenhouse gas emissions reporting protocol. Great. Up to you, Garrett.
Thanks, Nile. Hi, folks. Well, first, let me just say I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with everybody today. Lots of good folks doing amazing work on this call, and I hope to learn all about all of your work at the 2017 National Adaptation Forum, if not before. So I'll start with just a few words about the USDN network that I serve. This is a peer network of local government staff in about 145 cities across the U.S. and Canada. Our members are sustainability directors and other staff in their departments or in related departments who are generally charged with helping their communities enhance sustainability, broadly defined. Been around for about 7 years. The basic model, this is not an organization on which cities are on the listserv. This is an active peer network with just a couple of staff that help put cities together to talk about the stuff they want to talk with peers about. So we launch peer conversations wherever there's a critical mass of cities that want to talk about the same thing. This year, I think we have about 25 different streams of conversation going, generally monthly calls each that are exclusively open to local government staff, talking about building energy efficiency strategy or urban forestry or enhancing equity. It's about 600 folks that participate in these conversations, as well as a members-only Facebook-style website where cities are sharing updates with each other. They're posting questions to each other, answering each other's questions every day. Really interesting network model that's been very, very successful and was very useful when I was in Oakland for the first 5 years that it existed. It's a great way to learn from peers. USDN is also home to a lot of regranting funds. So there are funds that philanthropic partners provide that help enable cities to develop innovative ideas together, to get together and strategize about things, to send teams to each other, to learn from each other. Within the 25 content streams, there are more cities participating around climate preparedness in a group dedicated there than any other topic. We have monthly calls where we'll have 50 or 60 cities on the line sharing with each other how they've done a vulnerability assessment recently, or how they're working on a flood resilience strategy, or blah blah blah. Group of cities recently got a grant and are working together to develop training modules, saying we all need it to be easier for us as the internal climate champions to go have a conversation about climate preparedness with staff in other departments internally. So let's make it a little bit easier for all of us to pick up, a PowerPoint template and be able to do some things like that. Equity is another really hot topic in the network. City government is ramping up attention here in a big way over the last couple of years, and I think we've realized this is a felt priority for many, but it's also an area where sustainability directors in government are really hungry for ideas and examples of how to think about equity and understand equity issues in the context of their communities, and how to enhance equity through their work. We recently worked with Julie Nelson of the Government Alliance on Race and Equity and Glenn Harris at the Center for Social Inclusion to offer a professional development series for our local government members. We actually paid them to turn that series into a set of 15-minute videos, which you can grab on the USDN website. They're quite good, mostly focused kind of like a racial equity 101. How do we think about equity in the context of the way government operates? If you click that USDN.org link on the slide and you go up to projects and you click on equity on the right side of the screen, you can actually watch all of the videos from that series. Really, really well done, I think. So a lot of cities are now using this to train their own internal staff and starting to really take this seriously and think about ways to integrate it in their work. Lots happening on climate preparedness and equity independently, but we're also seeing some really interesting work now happening where we're bringing these things together. Last year, with support of the Kresge Foundation, we held a workshop at the 2015 National Adaptation Forum in which we brought teams of local government and community organization partners from about, I think it was 17 cities together in a room for a day to talk about how do we collaborate on climate preparedness more effectively. Learned a lot, great summary of lessons about what makes collaboration hard and what makes it successful, along with some models of it in practice that I'll make sure we share a link out to everyone on this call. Just a month or two ago, a group of cities led by Seattle received a grant to really take some next steps on that. They're building now some guidance to assist cities in their efforts to think about equity in the context of their climate preparedness planning work. They're trying to identify both specific climate resilience strategies that enhance both equity and preparedness at the same time, as well as strategies for collaborating with community members and organizations in the process of climate preparedness planning, which we've learned is really fundamental to getting to the kinds of outcomes that we want. How do we get beyond traditional engagement where city government puts a draft plan out there for public comment, holds a meeting at City Hall once and says that we've worked with the community and we've gotten approval on this, into a mode where there's real collaboration in the planning process itself with shared power and a much higher likelihood that we're going to land on the strategies that really meet community needs while enhancing climate resilience. We held a workshop on this with 12 cities with the Georgetown Climate Center just a couple weeks ago. Cities were talking about examples of where they have opportunities to address equity and climate preparedness at the same time in the work they're doing this year. We heard about Baltimore's efforts to identify and design physical climate resiliency hubs in Baltimore. We heard from Cleveland about the efforts to design resident engagement programs with working with neighborhood ambassadors. We heard about redevelopment planning opportunities in Denver and DC, thinking about updating its comprehensive plan. Lots of really interesting opportunities through common local government processes to advance climate resilience and equity at the same time. So we're really interested in helping to build that menu and learn from each other as we do. One last quick story we heard from Seattle at that workshop. Seattle actually said they recently got a grant to work on urban heat resilience in 2 lower income neighborhoods in Seattle with large immigrant populations. They actually hired an equity consultant to study how well they did, not to help them figure out what the solution should be, but to actually study how well they did at setting up a process for coming to a solution that itself was collaborative with folks in the communities that they were trying to serve. And they didn't do all that well, but it's one of the first times I've seen a city government actually apply, not just take equity training, but actually apply this in a way directly to a project that they've been working on. I think there's a lot of great lessons from that, and we can share some more information about that too.
Garrett, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. So the next presenter is Kirsten Schwinn. She is the co-founder and senior strategist in Bay Localize in the Bay Area. Kirsten holds a BA in economics and public policy from Swarthmore College and an MS in natural resource management from the University of Michigan. She authored Bay Localize's Community Resilience Toolkit and co-authored Tapping the Potential of Urban Rooftops, which won an award from the American Planning Association's California chapter. Kirsten is deeply involved in local energy policy and formerly served as the chair of the City of Berkeley's Energy Commission. At Bay Localize, Kirsten convenes the Bay Area Resilient Communities Initiative and takes the lead on resilient services, workshops, and consulting. Kirsten?
Thanks, Nile. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you're great.
All right, great. Well, I want to thank National Adaptation Forum and Nile for organizing this webinar, and also big shout out also to Shamar and the Kresge Foundation for funding so much wonderful work, both our work and many of our colleagues as well. So as Nile mentioned, Bay Localize was founded 10 years ago specifically to catalyze a grassroots movement for community resilience based on equity and human rights. Nile knows this well. He's worked with us over the years. And it's really wonderful to see 10 years later that movement is alive and well. And I want to thank also the speaker from UPROSE for giving a good context about just transition and the environmental justice principle that leaders from frontline communities really need to be able to speak for themselves, that the experience they bring is a form of expertise in terms of what impacts look like in their communities and what is really realistically needed to address that. And that frontline community leaders really need to be in positions of leadership in policy making. But there is a role for everybody in supporting that effort. Now, could you go to the first slide? So at Bay Localize, we've been building a regional coalition around our region in San Francisco Bay Area called the Resilient Communities Initiative. And this is a list of our 11 members. These are grassroots organizations and frontline communities feeling the immediate impacts of climate change, as well as some ally groups. And next slide, please. And one of the things that we have learned from our allies over the years through a major regional survey, reaching people who are most impacted by climate change, a number of focus groups and so on, that people who are most impacted by climate change want to be working with local governments on equity by building partnerships from the very beginning of the planning process. And I think Garrett really alluded to some of this. That the traditional planning process of, you write a report and you put it, or you write a plan, and you put it out for comment and so on, it often, doesn't do enough to take into account or to highlight, the real expertise and leadership and the very unique set of knowledge that people who are most impacted by climate change have in terms of what that looks like in their communities and what the most effective responses will be. And that expertise is a real asset for planners. That in fact, I think that climate change is such a huge unfunded mandate on local governments. Must be an incredibly daunting undertaking. And that I do believe that the only way we are going to be effective with the limited resources that local governments have is to harness the expertise and enthusiasm and energy of community groups. That includes to do that, we really need to be building those relationships and partnerships of respect from the very beginning of the planning process and how the planning happens. And also includes investing in those relationships with community groups and especially community coalitions. That, if you have some consultant dollars to spend, consider investing those in those relationships with the people who will be there sandbagging with you at 2 a.m. when there's a flood in your community. And a traditional consultant, they're going to be at home sleeping in their beds. But the community groups, they will be there. If you build those relationships, they will be there with you during the emergencies, stepping up to work with you if those relationships are built. Next slide, please. So this year, with support from the Kresge Foundation, we're launching a Regional Resilience Leadership Academy. So the goal of this academy is to ensure that folks from frontline communities are in leadership positions in policymaking in the region and to build a regional model of community-led adaptation policymaking. So we have a series of grassroots trainings around the region, training up leaders. We just had the one in the South Bay last week. We had representatives from the homeless community. We had folks from the immigrant community. We had the one in the North Bay on Saturday. We had farm workers there. And really people who are just so hungry and interested in getting involved in the planning process and yearning for that access. We'll have a training for agency staff on June 6th on best practices and working with community groups and really looking at some deeply tried and true models that have worked for agencies. And then we'll be bringing the graduates of those two sets of trainings together in a series of policy workshops. They're really more about policy brainstorms, getting at some of the key equity issues around climate adaptation in the Bay Area: flooding and sea level rise, heat emergencies, air quality and public health, guaranteeing access to food, water, and electricity, racial equity and emergency preparedness and response, housing, social cohesion and displacement, and funding resilience efforts to ensure equity. As you might notice that we're framing climate adaptation in some ways that you may not have seen before, but these are some of the issues that are really front and center to the grassroots communities who are most impacted. And we want to put out a call out to any folks who may be on this webinar from the Bay Area or from California, from agencies who may want to be involved in this Leadership Academy. You can go to Eventbrite and register for the June 6th training. It'll be held in downtown Oakland at the California Endowment Training Center. I really welcome your involvement in that.
Great. Thank you so much, Kirsten. And our last speaker for this round is Shamar Bibbins. She's the Program Officer in the Environment Program at Kresge Foundation, where her grant making supports policies and programs that help communities build resilience in the face of climate change. Shamar plays a lead role in managing the Environment Program's Climate Resilience and Urban Opportunity Initiative. That initiative supports community-based nonprofit organizations seeking to influence local and regional climate resilience planning, policy development, and implementation while reflecting the priorities and needs of low-income people. She also contributes to the development and implementation of the program strategies. Welcome, Shamar. It's on you.
Thank you, Nile. Can you hear me fine?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you, and it is such a pleasure to be a part of today's conversation. It's always great to be on the line and just with our partners and just to hear all of the great work that's happening. You know, our Kresge's president, Rip Rapson, he often speaks about 4 qualities that philanthropy uniquely possesses. And, you know, as I just listen to the work and I'm reminded about all of the great work of our partners, you know, and just listening to the rich conversation, it really reminds me of some of those qualities and the unique position that foundations, you know, can play and do play in elevating the voice and needs of marginalized communities and those who've been left out of both the economic and social mainstream, which really, in many respects, is our core philanthropic responsibility. So, you know, foundations, we support the work from a financial standpoint, of course, as we are often looked to do. But, you know, there are so many ways that our support can extend beyond, obviously, just the financial resources. We are able to really deploy a wide variety of tools and resources, including our convening power and our strategic communication capabilities, and really the ability to step back and kind of work from this 30,000-foot level, which has its own limitations in its own right, but it really does allow us to step back from the fray and look for connections among the work and to really kind of move toward a vision and North Star that's informed by like this really broad view. So I will just spend a few minutes sharing a bit about Kresge's environment program and some examples of how we're working to advance climate resilience with equity front and center. So next slide, please. So for those of you who may not be familiar with very familiar with the Kresge Foundation, our overall mission of the foundation is to increase opportunity for low-income people in American cities. And the foundation's work is organized into 6 programs that all have distinct strategic missions. And so those 6 programs include arts and culture, education, health, human services, environment, and our comprehensive community development work in Detroit. In addition to the 6 topically focused programs, we also have a really robust social investment practice where we are able to offer nonprofit support in the form of program-related investment and loan guarantees. Our environment program is focused on helping communities build their resilience in light of climate change. And our program is distinct in that we advance a comprehensive and integrated approach to resilience that encompasses climate mitigation, adaptation, and social cohesion. And we also elevate the inclusion and influence of low-income and vulnerable populations in efforts to build resilience. So our belief is that to truly build resilience, a community must simultaneously work across all 3 of those pieces, and that they must work to reduce, you know, pollution. They also have to prepare for the effects and strengthen social connectivity and cohesion. And when we talk about social cohesion, we don't use it necessarily as a proxy for equity or social inclusion, but given that we know that climate change disproportionately affects people with limited resources, economic resources, we believe that the climate resilience field will be more effective if we're by incorporating the knowledge and the perspectives of low-income and racially and ethnically diverse communities, which we've heard many of the speakers before speak about. And so our hope is that these communities are able to share in the economic and the environmental and social benefits that clean energy and green infrastructure and other public responses to climate change actually will bring forth. So our program, the environment program, focuses on both place-based and field-building efforts through 4 distinct focal areas, which include urban energy resilience, our work in sustainable water resources management, climate resilience in coastal cities, and our climate resilience and urban opportunity work, which I manage at the foundation. And so, you know, our hope is that our work across these 4 focal areas is really intended to help civic leaders ask the climate question. So we increasingly want the folks that are making decisions that are important to the form or function of cities to explicitly factor in climate change into their decision-making considerations. And simultaneously, if we're continuing to be successful in our work, that as they're asking this climate question, simultaneously, we increasingly want those same decision makers to think about as to whether a particular project that they will be bringing forth will bring new benefits to low-income people, or will it reduce the risk low-income communities face, or will it create some kind of adverse effect? And so given our focus on climate and urban opportunity and our focus on cities, last year we launched, in 2014 actually, we launched a new initiative, which is the Climate Resilience and Urban Opportunity Initiative. And so unlike the work in our energy and our water pieces of our portfolio, where the entry point for that work is particularly issue-based, it's particularly focused on targeting city-level practitioners, the purpose of the Climate Resilience and Urban Opportunity Initiative is really to strengthen the capacity of community-based organizations to influence local and regional climate resilience planning and policy development to better reflect the priorities and the needs of low-income people in U.S. cities. And our hope through this piece of work is that this strengthened capacity will lead to the development of more effective climate resilience measures in multiple venues and cities. And specifically, so through that program, we specifically support a cadre of organizations, it's about 20 place-based, who all have a strong track record of accomplishment in low-income communities and who are interested in deepening their expertise and their ability to engage on climate issues to influence those public-led processes that are happening in their cities or in their region relevant to climate resilience. And through that, our explicit goal is to build and grow the number of individuals and organizations who have a strong perspective around equity and a strong understanding of the needs and interests of low-income communities, and who are also viewed as climate resilience experts. And so outside of the Climate Resilience and Urban Opportunity Initiative, we of course work to support efforts across all of the focal areas to support practitioners who are working on climate resilience efforts with a social justice lens, or who are building their climate resilience work to have a more explicit focus on equity. And so we want to make sure that equity is infused, of course, throughout the entire portfolio. And as we're working to spread equity across the portfolio and strengthen that as a key piece of all of the work, we are also making sure that we are increasingly working across the four focal areas to make sure that our definition of the comprehensive view of resilience, to include both adaptation, mitigation, and social cohesion, are rounded out throughout the program. And so earlier I talked about our foundation's ability to convene, and I feel that one of the ways that we are really, I feel a really powerful piece of our work is our ability to convene our grantees, to facilitate learning. And so we regularly host opportunities to bring together grantees across our portfolio, or support our grantees to bring together organizations. So Garrett talked about the event at the National Adaptation Forum last year, where we brought together CBOs and members from the USDN network. The Climate Resilience and Urban Opportunity Initiative was designed to actually host an annual event, which we'll be hosting actually next week as the second annual, which brings together not only the grantees within the initiative, but also grantees from across the portfolio to have a really deep learning exchange. And it brings together almost 100 of our grantees to come together to learn and exchange. And we've heard last year, all sorts of great new relationships or relationships that were already there that by just being in the room were strengthened. And so we're hoping that will continue to increase as we host that event every year. And then we also are supporting through our cross-cutting field building work across the portfolio. We also support broader efforts to support equity across the environmental field. So work around, you may be familiar with the Green 2.0 work, which really helps to build leadership within the environmental field. So we support some of those efforts as well. And then finally, if you turn to the next slide, I think one of the other pieces that is really important to call out is our ability and our partnerships with grantees on research to support the state of scholarship on climate resilience and equity. And this is a very, just a couple bullets I wanted to share. Obviously, there's many other pieces I could have put here, But these are three pieces I just wanted to call out that we've worked with our partners with. So Movement Strategy Center has a publication called Pathways to Resilience, which really lays out a very robust pathway to how you actually transform cities from a community-led approach. Bounce Forward is a publication that we worked with Island Press on and received a lot of really great feedback, and I strongly encourage you to take a look at it if you haven't already. And then I called out NAACP's Equity in Building Resilience and Climate Adaptation Planning, their indicators. It was top of mind recently, I think just last week. The California Department of Public Health, their Office of Health Equity, announced a Safeguarding California Implementation Plan. And in that plan, in the health chapter, they actually highlight and use NAACP's resilient indicators. And so I think they're a tool that's really helpful in looking at some of the equity factors around climate adaptation planning. So I will stop there and look forward to questions later. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Shamar. And if I had the opportunity, I would give you a round of applause for all your great input into this conversation around equity, engagement, and reflecting on your work and how we can actually better bring more equity-focused lens to adaptation field. So thank you all so much. Real quick, I just think we're closing on the end of the hour here, and what I want to do is actually open it up to the presenters if there's any other comment. I know Garrett needs to jump off the phone real quick, and then we're going to open up to other questions with all of the participants. So I just wanted to see if any of the speakers wanted to have an additional comment, and I want to start with you, Garrett, because I know you have to jump off soon if you have any additional comment.
Sure. Thanks, Nile. And I'm sorry I have to hop, but I really appreciate the conversation. You talked about how do we do a better job of this? What are the challenges that really make this hard, and how do we do a better job of enhancing equity and really basing it in collaboration at the local level to do a better job on all the work that we're talking about here. And I've asked a lot of city government staff these questions and had a lot of one-on-one conversations with them, and just a couple of things that I've heard from them. The very idea of working on climate preparedness is, of course, generally new and different, and that's the case within government, just as it's the case for all of us societally more broadly. So it doesn't live within any one department's responsibility. It takes time, it takes effort, it's information, it's figuring out, what can we really do about this? How is this relevant to my role, et cetera? And we've got a lot of other priorities already. So there's, clearly there are resource challenges, and there will always be resource challenges. But more broadly within local government, the culture of planning, of dealing with risk, it's often not a culture of collaboration. There are some great exceptions out there, but in general, city government, we're used to putting full draft plans out for comment and sort of checking the box, broadly speaking. We're not government staff. There's no 101 training you go to before you take a job within City Hall where you were taught how to collaborate with community members or community organizations, nor that you should. And if anything, we're often taught not to give preference to certain folks in the community, not to make there an appearance of a biased process if you were to do some of the things that, we do see examples of cities that are stepping out, and I think providing better models of how do we make it possible for a lot of folks to really participate in the planning process who otherwise wouldn't be able to do that, and looking at what, the community listening sessions that they've done in Baltimore, where you're providing food and transportation and childcare and your language translation, and you're not talking to folks about, here's our flood resilience plan, what do you think? You're saying, hey, remember when it rained a lot last week? How did that go for you? What did you do? Where did you go? Was there anyone depending on you that you couldn't get to? There's a different way of approaching this. There's a lot of challenges that are out there that are historic, and in many cities where there are existing issues between local government and community groups, and it's hard to separate those from some of the climate preparedness planning that's going on, even if the staff within the city that are the climate champions have nothing to do, generally speaking, with that work. There's trust issues. There's a tendency for staff within cities to feel like they kind of need to get their house in order first. Let's get the data. Let's think about this before we put something out for folks to see. Maybe it'll be scary. Maybe there'll be risk and there'll be lawsuits. Let's think about this. There's just this culture of let's go slow. Let's be cautious. as opposed to a culture of let's try to engage in collaboration as early as possible and be able to embrace all the perspectives that will come with that. That will really help us get to the best solutions. And I think, for me, the takeaway from the session that we had at the Adaptation Forum in 2015, one of the big takeaways anyways, was that relationships are really key when you're talking about this work at the local level. This is a long-term challenge. There are so many different places and opportunities to enhance equity and climate preparedness at the same time through lots of different things that both exist as government plans and processes and that exist very separate from government. And the only way that we really set ourselves up to recognize those, to prioritize them well, to bring good ideas into the process, to enable understanding and partnerships and voices and perspectives to be part of the process that might not otherwise be, is to start with relationships that are not about let's try to engage some folks because we're going through, we're trying to get plan X done, let's put it out for comment, or let's think about how do we engage folks within that context. But really government and folks at the community level developing much more robust long-term relationships that you're able to draw on as the work goes forward. So I think I've been very heartened to see the community of cities within USDN. We're learning a lot of these lessons. There seems to be a lot of synergy in what we're learning within these cities that are maybe at the more progressive end of thinking about this. And I think it's a lot of opportunity now for all of us to build on. So the examples of how do we take it to the next level and do that well? What exactly does it look like? Ready to ask for a community organization to say, what do you need if to be able to play the role that you can play in this work, and obviously it's much broader than that. But it's been great to see the progress that's been made within this network of cities, and you all have my contact info. I got to hop now, but I'll be happy to connect with folks offline to talk about this some more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Garrett. Really value your leadership. Been knowing you for a while, even in Oakland, working on the Oakland Climate Action Plan. And so that's really, really helpful insight and input. So I'm going to just kind of see if there's anyone else who have any kind of last comment. Then there's a few questions we have online. I want to start with you, Ryan. Just kind of a 1 to 2 minute comment or thought reflection thus far.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I would just want to express our pleasure in really hearing others, the other presenters today, underline the importance of just relationships. When we talk about the sort of daunting and overwhelming amount of work that needs to be done, both at a very local level, but also at a national level, we talk a lot about the allocation of resources and sort of public policy, and these are all extremely important, and these are areas that we take very seriously and engage in every day. But a lot of it does come down at the end of the day to just how we're working with one another, how we are really sort of examining what real efficient and just collaboration looks like, and particularly, when we're talking about collaboration at the grassroots level for community-based organizations like ours working in frontline communities, when we work with either other organizations or consultants or city agencies, as Garrett was getting at, there's a traditional model of really looking at the grassroots as something of a client, and I was very happy to hear the recognition that really the solutions that we need to be embracing right now really are coming out of the grassroots, across this country. Communities that not only know the crisis inside out, but have been working on local solutions for many, many years now. I think that as we move forward and we really try to tackle some of these challenges that folks are, talking about today, I think that, how we work with one another, how we perceive one another, how we know our roles, and how we really are able to at times step back and at other times step up, I think is going to be critical to really, putting forward workable climate solutions.
Great, thank you so much. Before I open up to other comments, I think we should just move to straight to questions, just to see if any other participants on the webinar have questions for the speakers. So Alex, you want to take that on, please?
Sure. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. This one is specifically for Shalini, and this is by Davin Dillingham. And the question was, how is the high-risk energy poverty determined? Are these just low-income communities, or are there other factors?
So that energy vulnerability metric is being refined, but there are other factors that are pulled into that in addition to low income based on the research. For example, age of housing stock is one of them, and there's a few others that some of our researchers that developed the Energy Vulnerability Index can get into deeper, but each aspect of that is based on the current research of what might contribute to a family's energy burden, and then is weighted accordingly and combined into a weighted metric around that. So it is more than income, and it has multiple factors involved with it.
Okay, great. And this one is from Shannon McNeely, and I think this one will go specifically to Nile and Lara, and probably myself, but generally is that she has one general comment about the equity theme. It seems that this was a great presentation, and she admires all the work, but it seems that it was really urban focused, as there was not any focus on rural or tribal communities. It would be great to see more connections made at NAF between the equity theme and these other populations.
Great comment. And we've talked about that inside out. This is Nile. And I think we are wanting to do a series just to get to that question right there, because we really wanted to get more rural and tribal communities on the call. I mean, these are the people that are presenting today are just kind of the low-hanging connections that we have, and we were trying to build into a few more, but the timing of it all. So we hope that this will be a part of an ongoing series of conversations around equity. Like I mentioned in my kind of in my context setting of the call, is that we're building a learning community, and obviously those questions around equity are really essential, and also to the communities in which we want to have at the table. So I would just say stay tuned for more of this conversation, and definitely want to bring that perspective to the field and to this broader group.
Lara, do you have any other follow-up?
No, I think that Nile just did a lovely job of providing the overview of the plan. That we do entirely intend to move into that space and have the conversation continue. This should be seen as the beginning of a conversation about this with the NAF webinar series, not the only opportunity that this will come up.
Okay, great. This question is specifically for Kirsten, who is doing similar type of social equity planning training in the Gulf Coast region, specifically in Texas Gulf Coast. Do you know of anyone? This is Gavin Dillingham.
Oh, I wish I knew. But if Shamar, if you're still on the call, you may know of some folks doing that.
Yes, I do. Is it in the New Orleans region in particular? I'm sorry, I didn't catch the actual region. Or was it in Texas? I couldn't.
It said Texas Gulf Coast region. Yes, Shamar.
Yes, I can follow up separately with a couple of suggestions. If I can just follow up directly, that would be great.
Okay, I'll make sure to connect Gavin with you for sure. I think I have one more question here, and this again goes for Shalini. Does energy vulnerability refer to the ability to afford energy or the infrastructure itself? And this is from Lexi Brewer.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the concepts of energy vulnerability are very new to the United States. So these concepts have really been looked at more robustly, like in the United Kingdom, for different planning purposes for building energy resiliency. And here it's, a combination of things in terms of energy burden, in terms of socioeconomic pieces. So sort of a family's ability to pay is one aspect of it. So low-income families tend to have a much higher energy burden, meaning that a much higher percentage of their income goes to paying their sort of household energy bills. So that's one aspect of it in terms of income. And then the other side is an infrastructure piece of it as well, because a lot of the infrastructure that of low-income communities and other communities tend to live in, that's why you need to develop the metric that goes beyond income, is around the actual housing stock. And so, whereas like the square footage of the amount of energy used per square foot in many households that have sort of been disinvested in historically through different, historic housing policies, through lack of access to finance for upgrading, the lack of sort of targeting of energy programs for efficiency dollars, or infrastructure, other infrastructure problems that have come up that have impeded the investment of energy investments in that community, such as asbestos and infrastructure, et cetera, also kind of play into it. So it's a joint sort of infrastructure question of where investments in infrastructure have gone due to various policies, as well as the socioeconomic, because the burden falls higher based on income as well.
Great, thank you. I think that is all the pertinent questions now. I'll send it back to you to do any closing remarks.
Yes, I just wanted to just thank once again our speakers, and I just also want to let people know that's on the call. I mean, the question around rural and the South and other areas, particularly around the climate equity piece. If you have any particular institution, organizations, or individuals, please get in contact with us about them, because we want to be in touch as we're kind of building out this conversation. Like I mentioned, building out this learning community around these issues and trying to push for solutions. So I just wanted people to stay tuned for that, but also be engaged with us. So I think we really appreciate your feedback as we move forward. And I actually want to just see, I let Ryan do like a closing comment, but I wanted to see if any other speakers had a closing comment, and if not, we're going to begin to start wrapping up the call. But I just wanted to and focus on next steps. I wanted to see if any other speakers had a kind of summary last comment, or if not. And if not, this has been an amazing call. I really value everyone's leadership, the speakers, and I really appreciate for having a good participation. Like I mentioned, please stay tuned for more of these conversations as we build up to the National Adaptation Forum in next May 2017. These conversations we've been having throughout the country, basically, are really essential to really looking at some of the challenges and finding solutions and how we build and implement projects that's really engaging the broader community. So I just really value the speakers and your participation and everyone that's participating in the call. Thank you so much. Laura, do you have any other closing remarks?
Yep, just a couple. I'm hoping that after the conversation today and some of the great examples that came up, that people will be inspired to submit a nomination for the White House Champion of Change on Climate Equity. Again, a few details there on your screen. And then some additional information going forward. Next slide, please. I want to thank all of the speakers today for the fantastic, tangible examples that they provided about how equity is being incorporated into holistic adaptation around the country. Point taken that the Gulf Coast was not on our list, and we need to certainly share more of the examples and ideas that are coming out of rural adaptation planning and tribal adaptation planning. We have had fantastic tribal engagement in the National Adaptation Forum since the beginning. And to that, I'm extremely grateful, because the examples that are coming out of tribal communities are not just useful for tribal communities, but there's a lot that we can apply more broadly because of their inherent holistic approach that they have been taking in most tribal communities on adaptation. But as Nile said, more tangible examples from those areas also to be shared in coming conversations. And please share ideas, or if you want to volunteer to participate in a webinar to address those issues, get in touch with us. And continuing the conversation to think about the integration of those two things is really high on my list. How do we think about urban adaptation planning and urban equity incorporation as in concert with more rural adaptation planning? Because cities are islands in a larger landscape, and the decisions we make in cities dramatically impact the world around them. So some next steps going forward. The National Adaptation Forum has an equity working group that will hold its next meeting on April 29th. Additionally, there's a steering committee. There are steering committee and program meetings coming up in May. Getting comments and ideas from participants in this webinar before those two dates, very helpful in getting input and making sure that we're integrating the best ideas that people are having so that we can make the forum and the products that come out of the forum as useful as possible for the whole community. The program committee's draft call for proposals is happening in May, and this will be part of that process. The next National Adaptation webinar will be focused on the Southeast, so hopefully we'll get a little bit of Gulf Coast information out with this. And it'll be focusing on water resources in the Southeast and the U.S. Caribbean, and that will be on June 22nd. So register for that now. And as we mentioned, part 2 of the equity webinar series will be happening in July. Date to be determined, because we have to put together the full panel and find out when people are available. Finally, as you're starting to think about your submissions for the National Adaptation Forum, the call for proposals is opening August 8th. Finally, this webinar has been recorded, and it will be posted on both the forum and the CAKE websites. Make sure that you check out not only this webinar, but past webinars. The last webinar was, in fact, on the importance of traditional ecological knowledge in adaptation planning, and had a good bit of conversation about more rural, natural resource, and tribal issues. Thank you all for your participation today, not just the panelists, but everyone who called in and listened and asked questions and shared ideas. Please feel free to continue sharing thoughts with us and sharing the content that was presented here with other people in your networks. Until next time, EcoAdapt, the National Adaptation Forum, and the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange wish you success in all of your adaptation endeavors, and we look forward to seeing you in St. Paul in May of 2017. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.